Help support this channel and get early access to videos plus exclusive content and patrons-only live discussions by becoming a member at patreon.com/Bruce Poinsette. So if you know me, you know I'm a bit of a sucker for a good media literacy conversation. And sure enough, the Torre show last week gave me some gold. Torre had Bomani Jones and Michael Smith on to talk about hip hop 50, have a wide ranging hip hop 50s celebration. And one of the things that came up in there was this idea of how the conversation as far as the music and hip hop has become much more nationalized recently. Whereas there was a point where it was very regional, especially like when I was growing up in like the 90s, early 2000s, where you knew where everyone was from, where people made it very clear, I'm talking about my community. I'm telling you about the fashions, what's happening on the streets, what's, all the different little nuances of where I'm from. And I'm bringing that to the national conversation, and people learning about this was happening in New Orleans. This was happening in Newark. This was happening in the Bronx. This was happening in Queens. This was happening in LA. This was happening in the Bay. This was happening up in Seattle, the Midwest, et cetera, et cetera. Hey, it's me coming to you from the editing bay, popping in to add that this also applies to artists who are just swinging through towns, passing through towns. So I recently talked to Tron, aka Grape God, aka Old Grape God, for a project called Life After the Bubble for Respond to Racism LO. You should check that out. It's coming out this fall. But anyways, he talked about how this applies to Mac Dre and simply just referencing suburbs of Portland in his music.
He has that song with Something Terrible, Debo, that everybody knows. That's just about Robin, like us. We go to Montego, and it's fucking tight. Because I think Something Terrible used to like live in Westland, but it's like, I know every Mac Dre bar where he references like something in the Portland suburbs. He talks about like Blue Dolphin on McLaughlin. The something you should know. There's like I stay I stay in Westland. That's where my dad lives or something like that. And it's like there's like funny ass things, and I remember being like, well, that's my favorite rapper, and he was here, so at least that's he passed through here. He did what I would hope anybody from outside would do, coming to like Oswego.
Now it's very much become a conversation. We're all talking about the same national talking points. It's like the same five things. And this conversation should sound familiar because it's been the radio conversation for most of the time I've been alive. I remember when there was a discussion about Clear Channel or then iHeart pushing out local radio stations, and how you get these playlists decided by someone, you know, out in another state, or just some corporation to be exact. And what you lose is some opportunities for local artists, local discussion, and it just becomes again a very nationalized conversation. Fast forward to 2023, big radio has clearly won. And everything that the advocates of local stations, regional stations tried to warn people about has materialized. Even and now we're seeing a hyper version of this conversation with the algorithm, when it comes to podcasts, when it comes to YouTube, when it comes to social media content, where again the algorithm steers you towards talking about the same topics. Many YouTube creators have done, when they've explained, here's how I go about making content. They're very clear. It's like, I must, the algorithm is what is paying me. If I go against the algorithm, I'm not going to get the views. I'm not going, it's not going to be sustainable for me to do this channel. So it's a tough reality of the industry. And to be clear, that's not to say that there aren't people doing it on the indie level. In fact, you probably have not probably you absolutely have more options for indie radio or podcast content than ever before. It has been democratized. However, those indie outlets are still fighting against the infrastructure of big stations when it comes to marketing, when it comes to getting people's attention, even beyond the algorithm. If there are more options, if everyone, the joke is that everyone has a podcast, right? If everyone has a podcast, the audiences still have limited attention. Like, just there's not that much time to consume everything. You have to make choices. You have to, oftentimes, you're dependent on marketing just to let people know that something exists. I think in talking with a lot of other creators, I think we assume that because we put it out there that everyone knows what we're doing. Everyone is aware. And the reality is, like, people scroll through. If you're advertising something in your IG stories, for example, like, I think a lot of people, we see that scene list and we're like, oh, they were paying attention. But we do this. Like, I scroll through like zip, 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 zip. And I imagine people scroll through my stuff the exact same way. So when someone with big infrastructure can make a billboard, can make sponsored posts, can beat you over the head with the fact that their thing exists every day, never mind have actual like good viral marketing or support good viral marketing, it's a tough competition. But let's bring it back to the music. So what does this mean with hip hop? I think it's an effect of, again, how we interact with each other. What do we know about what's happening in different parts of the country? What are we exporting information wise to the rest of the country? And I'll bring it back to Portland in a second, but when I think about my favorite albums from this year, technically four projects come to mind. There's a JPEG Mafia and Danny Brown Scaring the Hose, and their Scaring the Hose DLC pack. So we're going to count that as one. It's Magic 2 by Nas and Hit Boy. And there's K Tramine by Amine, local hip hop hero, and K Tronada. So with Magic 2 is Nas. And again, speaking of that old school, Nas is still telling you about Queens. He reps Queens hard. He has 50 Cent on there. Like, you know where he's from. You get that feel. With K Tramine, it's not obviously Amine reps Portland hard, although conversationally, like, it's not it's just kind of, the album is more, it's fun. It is more general, again, kind of fitting more of that newer generation, more nationalized conversation mold. And then you have Scaring the Hose, where the juxtaposition is interesting because Danny Brown very much, like, he even has a line like, Michigan legend like Mateen Cleaves. Like, he's very much in that mold. He's about 41 years old, letting you know where he's from. It's a very big part of the music. JPEG Mafia, who I didn't realize is only 33, which is a year younger than me. But, you think about the name, you think about the style, it's very much, that conversation is much more fits the nationalized mode. Although I think what has drawn me to this project especially is just like how much the commentary mixed in there. It's one of those projects where it's like, let me, shock the system with like just the name itself, with a lot of the imagery and the art around it. But then they'll also have, we'll talk about Jack Harlow and appropriation in hip hop. Like, they have a song and a whole skit on the DLC pack where it's very clear where they're talking about artists or technology even being used as vehicles to push larger problematic things. So with Jack Harlow, they make fun of the fact that Jack Harlow had a KFC combo meal, which still wild when you think about it. And they're like, yeah, the Kentucky cornball's coming out with his next thing, genetically modified seed from Monsanto. And it's like, oh, I see what you did there. So it's a nationalized conversation, but at least it's a nationalized conversation with, some real commentary and real stakes. But again, it's just like this juxtaposition between Danny Brown and JPEG Mafia and how they go about it. And again, it was interesting learning JPEG Mafia is only a year younger than me, but it's like grew up in New York, went to school in Alabama, like 13, I want to say, served in the military. So he's been stationed all over the world. Then came back, did some music out of Baltimore, and now is in LA. So when I think about just the nationalized tone of his conversation, it makes perfect sense. So now let's talk about this in terms of how this affects what people know about Oregon, how people learn about Portland. Like I mentioned Amine earlier. And it is it shouldn't be the role of artists, obviously, to like teach the rest of the country about what's happening in their communities or the communities where they grew up. Amine has been based in LA for a while now. Like he comes through and does a bunch of stuff in Portland, but like a lot of artists, it's important to be close to like all the industry stuff. So they're in LA or they're in Atlanta or they're in New York. It's no different. And what you do get, though, with this nationalized conversation, I've just noticed is that people really don't know what's happening in Portland. And maybe if they counted on whatever role hip hop might play in that before, you can tell kind of like the difference now with this nationalized conversation, where what's always been funny to me is like, even to take it to a political level, it's wild seeing progressive YouTubers repeat People for Portland's talking points. For those who don't know, People for Portland is a lobbying group that's basically doing, they have billboards attacking the DA, Mike Schmidt. They have been very big on, just lobbying to, or being basically an arm of the Portland Business Alliance, which recently changed its name, to funnel more money to the police to basically like remove homeless people in downtown Portland. Not help, just shoo them away to somewhere else, to arrest them, to harass them, because that's what the businesses are lobbying for. So they have a bunch of very easily disputable, easily correctable talking points. But when it comes to like portraying Portland as like the place where we defunded the police and everything descended into anarchy and chaos, that is their messaging, and it seems ridiculous. But you will see even progressive YouTubers with like a national following who are from different places, from places where you can see similar dynamics, where you see somewhere like Atlanta and what's happening with Cop City, and you can get astute analysis on that. But then like Portland will catch these random strays where people talking about, yeah, it's not like Portland where the progressives have gone wild. And these are like progressive voices saying this. But how's that happen? Because that's the only, when it comes to like People for Portland, when it comes to these louder voices, when it comes to Willamette Week, exploiting these stories, when it comes to outside outlets coming in and exploiting these stories, that's what people are hearing. They're not hearing progressives. They're not hearing, the artists from the communities talking about these points when, it's hard enough just to, it makes sense as far as from an artist standpoint, when it's hard enough just to get your music out to the world in general, there's not really much incentive to also be really tailoring it to talking about what's happening in Portland, because again, that goes against the algorithm. Which brings me back to my role as, as a reporter, as a media personality. I had a friend, longtime collaborator, recently reached out, was asking me, am I going to be doing anything for Hip Hop 50? Like, he's saying he hasn't seen much local convo, at least in the media space. There's been events, and I'll shout out DJ Cliff and the Mic Check anniversary that's coming up. But when I look at my involvement in the hip hop space, I've noticeably stepped back from covering a lot of things in these recent years. Part of it's just feeling a little bit, just getting older. I'm not I don't go to shows like I used to. I'm not up on, some of the newer artists like I used to, and it kind of feels irresponsible to be speaking on the scene when I don't really have that same kind of engagement. And then on a deeper level, it's just hasn't there've been different points where it's felt like it's been more fun to be a fan. And I think it's not the fault of hip hop. I think just some of the conditions in the city and what's happening have, it's exacerbated a lot of angst that was already there. Like when I think about, one of the most fun scenes that I've witnessed more recently, I have to go back to Dodgers farewell show and with Marquee opening up and just seeing like the way the crowd was into it at the Rose and the way the crowd was just like swaying. Again, this is for the opener of the show, and the whole venue is rocking. And it's just like, and I bring up Marquee because shout out to Jenny Moore at the Mercury, who, with her column, she recently noted that Marquee's actually recently announced her last show in the city. I guess at least, hopefully, at least for the time being. But it is it just hasn't I haven't had that inspiration. And yet when I look at the larger issues of what's happening, it's kind of set me back into, no, maybe there is a role. And there is a thing that needs to be covered. Again, we're talking about the 50th anniversary of hip hop. Hip hop was born out of the conditions of the South Bronx in like the late 60s, early 70s. Benign neglect, the South Bronx Expressway cutting right through the community, massive unemployment, especially for youth. People like landlords paying people to burn down the building so they could collect the insurance. White flight. It's all there, and it's all the story that Portland and so many communities are familiar with here with I-5. And now when you look at these conditions in the city and you look at what is in many cases benign neglect, cutting funds from everything but the police, watching the homelessness crisis get worse and worse, and only proposing solutions, only proposing police and prison solutions to this problem, watching cuts to education, watching a vicious backlash to anything about diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism post 2020. And it's like you can't divorce that from the conditions that created hip hop way back when. And you can see little signs of it in Portland. I was on I-5 to go visit someone the other day, and I was looking at the tags, the graffiti tags on I-5 on the way to the Rosa Parks Way exit. And it's not like graffiti is not, like a new thing, but I was just looking at like the detail of it. And I was like, oh, this is very reminiscent of the subways in the South Bronx at, during these early years of hip hop, as far as like the detail and the art of it. When I think about people who are, when we talk about youth unemployment, we talk about youth or neglecting opportunities, not investing in opportunities for youth. I think about the people who are. I mean, shout out to Andre Middleton and Friends of Noise doing concerts featuring youth artists, featuring youth setting up the whole thing, writing stories about it, and most importantly, that they're paying the kids for doing this. Like this work is happening. Many of these things that are very much akin, very much a part of that story, they're very familiar when you talk about the birth of hip hop, the growth of hip hop. They're happening right now. And I don't see a lot of coverage of that, especially in context. Even when I think about 2020 and the fact that so many of those protests, like the people on the front lines, some of the people leading those marches, those demonstrations, those rallies, people from the hip hop community. Like that was a big, big part of that. And I don't think it was an accident, but not much coverage really put that in context. So, I went through this whole thing of why I've just kind of like stepped back from covering hip hop stuff, just feeling like an old man out of touch. That's still true, but I want to thank that friend for reaching out and helping me think about this in particular, because when you see this need for like the contextualization of what's happening and its connection to hip hop, it's kind of giving me put a little battery back in my back as far as saying that's what I can do. That's what's needed. That's a gap I can fill. So what that will look like, I don't know. That the project is in the works and we'll just have to see. Stay tuned.